referring to Colonel Olcott. This was the man whom Madame Blavatsky was sent by her master to the United States to find, chosen by them to found with her the Theosophical Society, and then to spend the remainder of his life in organizing it all over the world. He brought to his task his unsullied record of public services rendered to his country, his keen capacity, his enormous powers of work, and an unselfishness which his colleague declared she had never seen equaled outside the ashram of the masters. He was found by Madame Blavatsky at the Eddy's farm, whither he had been sent by the New York Sun and the New York Graphic to report on the extraordinary spiritualist manifestations which there were taking place. So valuable were his articles that no less than 7 different publishers contended for the right to publish them in book form. So keen was the interest aroused that the papers sold at $1 a copy, and he was said to divide public attention with the second election of General Brandt to the presidency. The two brave hearts recognized each other, and the two clasped hands in a lifelong union, terminated on Earth when H.P. Blavatsky left it in 1891, but not terminated, so they both believed, by the trivial incident of death, but to be carried on upon the other side, and when returned again, to birth in this world. Many difficulties have confronted this lion-hearted man during these 31 years. He stood unflinchingly through the discreditable attack on Madame Blavatsky by the Society for Psychical Research, and has lived to see Dr. Hodgson accept more marvels than he then denounced. He steered the Society through the crisis which rent it for a time nearly the whole American section, to see that section welcome him to his native land with pride and exultation. He saw his colleague pass away from his side and bore the burden alone, steadfastly and bravely for another 16 years, knitting hands with me, her favorite pupil, as loyally and firmly as with herself. Through good report and evil report, he has worked unwaveringly until his master's voice has called him home. At that same order, he appointed me, his colleague, as his successor, to bear the burden H.P. Blavatsky and he had borne. He endured his last prolonged sufferings bravely and patiently, facing death as steadfastly as he had faced life, and cheered in the last weeks of his illness by the visits of the great Indian sages to whom he had given the strength of his manhood, the devotion of his life. He passed away from earth and left behind him a splendid monument of noble work, and on the other side he still will work till the time comes for his return. India has had no more faithful helper in the revival of her religions than this noble American, and she may well send her blessings to the man who loved and served her.
Henry Olcott was a man of many accomplishments. Born in 1832 in Orange, New Jersey, he was a distinguished officer in the Civil War and a slashing crusader against army graft. He was a member of the elite committee of 3, appointed to investigate the conspiracy that led to Abraham Lincoln's assassination. By the time he met Madame Blavatsky, he was an attorney in New York City.
Just personally, to me, it's from the moment I came to the Olcott grounds and learned about the founders, I was really drawn in different ways to all 3 of them. Of course, Madame Blavatsky, and to William Clon Judge and to Colonel Olcott. I had the opportunity at the time to work on the 1993 Parliament of the World's Religions that was here, which was a centenary of the 1893 event that Annie Besant and William Judge were speaking at, representing Colonel Olcott. This was an event that was very important in Colonel Olcott's mind. And over the years, I've had the chance in getting to know the Colonel through, of course, his writings, in the Theosophical Journal Theosophist, which is the International President's Journal, and, of course, the 6 volumes of old diary leaves that we have, his recounting of his experience. I've really learned to admire him to such a large degree, because he was someone who, at a time when we didn't have the kind of electronic wiring that allows for this type of communication today, he was traveling around the world in every form, however difficult it might be. You know, he was in various versions of carts that was hauled by people and had different animals. He was on sleds. He was on various ships, trains where possible. But as he went around, what he was doing, it seemed to me, was with his own wonderful sense of compassion and feeling of brotherhood for all humanity. He was sort of wiring on the astral level, if you wish, this global view of the world that we've come to take for granted and that we're struggling with at this time. So with that in mind, it was very interesting to me to find out that today, on February 1st in 1893, this was the first day of operation of Thomas Edison's laboratory for motion pictures in Orange, New Jersey, which is where, of course, Colonel Olcott was born. Colonel Olcott was in touch with Edison, and they had conversations that he relates in old diary leaves, which drew on their both interest in how energy was produced and the different forms of energy that were possible. So Edison was a member of the TS.
Olcott was born in 1832 in Orange, New Jersey. He came from the sort of sturdy American middle class, such a fascinating contrast with H.P. Blavatsky with their aristocratic old world Russian kind of background. And yet they made a team, most of the time anyway, calling themselves the Theosophical Twins. Not that there weren't spats once in a while. But Olcott went to college at New York University and then Columbia. At the time, he was very interested in agriculture and also in journalism. He spent a couple of years as a teenager with some uncles on a farm in Ohio. This was after his father's business failed back in New Jersey. And during this time, he found his uncles back there were very interested in spiritualism. He had a lot of exposure to it, went to a lot of seances and church meetings and so on, and wrote, in fact, some very enthusiastic articles at that time for spiritualist periodicals. His main interest, though, as I said, was in agricultural journalism then. He wrote regular columns on agriculture for various newspapers and magazines. He wrote a book which I think is still well regarded in agricultural circles on the growing of sorghum, a new crop in America then. And but then came the Civil War. He went in as a signal officer for a couple of years with the Union Army, then became very ill, was hospitalized for a while. During his hospitalization period, as he was recuperating, Stanton, Secretary of War, on the recommendation of one of the newspaper editors who knew him as a good investigative reporter, invited him to lead an investigation of certain corrupt suppliers to the Union Army. It was supposed to be a 2-week assignment, but it went on to 2 years or more. And he was very successful. He rooted out and prosecuted a number of people who were cheating the Union Army in terms of supplies. Then came the assassination of Lincoln in 1865, and on this background, Olcott became a member of a small commission in the War Department investigating the assassination. After the war, he returned to New York, took training as a lawyer, served as a lawyer for a while, but the interest in spiritualism, which he had had on his uncle's farm, which seems to have gone into abeyance after his marriage, actually, in 1860, I think it was, or was it 1850? Anyway, to a daughter of a minister. This marriage was not successful, and they were separated by the time of Olcott's involvement in theosophy.
One of the first things that Blavatsky did in the United States was to investigate spiritualism, interest in which was sweeping America and Europe. She went to the Eddy farmstead in Chittenden, Vermont, where remarkable phenomena were taking place. It was there that she met Colonel Olcott, reporting the events for a New York newspaper.
And he then became interested in spiritualism again. One of the more sensational phenomena then, this was 1874, was at the farm of the Eddy brothers in Chittenden, Vermont. And with a commission from a newspaper, Olcott went up there to investigate this phenomena and describe it. H.P. Blavatsky was also there, and that's where they met. I might just read a little bit from Olcott's fascinating old diary leaves, certainly a fascinating book to read because of the delightful way in which it's written, as well as for the very interesting information.
There's 6 volumes.
Six volumes of it. This is the first volume, you're right.
But it's well worth reading.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, as well as very informative. It's based on memory, so there may be a few inaccuracies, but it certainly gives the flavor of the early years of theosophy. Anyhow, he says that he went around the corner to a dealer and bought a copy of the Banner of Light. This was a spiritualist paper of the time. In it I read an account of certain incredible phenomena, the solidification of phantom forms, which were said to be occurring at a farmhouse in the township of Chittenden, in the state of Vermont. I saw at once that if it were true that visitors could see, even touch, and converse with deceased relatives who had found means to reconstruct their body and clothing so as to be temporarily solid, visible, and tangible, this was the most important fact in modern physical science. I determined to go and see for myself. And he went and describes, for example, some of the phenomena that they saw, and then describes his first meeting with HPB. The dinner hour at Eddy's was noon, and it was from the entrance door of the bare and comfortless dining room that I first saw HPB. She had arrived shortly before noon with a French-Canadian lady, and they were at a table as we entered. My eye was first attracted by the scarlet Garibaldian shirt the former wore, so as in vivid contrast to the dull colors around. Her hair was in a thick blonde mop, worn shorter than the shoulders, and it stood out from the head, silken soft and crinkled to the roots, like the fleece of a Cotswold ewe. This and the red shirt were what struck my attention before I took in the picture of her features. He began talking with her, and soon they found that in their interest in spiritualism, they had a tremendous amount in common, and of course remained together after returning to New York City. So far as the Eddy Brothers phenomenon is concerned, I don't have time to go into that, but I did bring a copy of this book, People from the Other World, by Olcott, which he wrote exhaustively about his experiences there, how he has measurements of everything, all kind of ways in which he tested for the possibility of fraud, and at least was convinced for himself that much of the phenomena was genuine or at least inexplicable in ordinary terms.
Si incontrarono negli Stati Uniti, a Chittenden, nel Vermont, dove egli era andato come giornalista per il New York Daily Graphic, per indagare i fenomeni che accadevano lì. Ella vi si recò perché aveva sentito parlare dei fenomeni dei fratelli Eddy.
Devo confessare che quando la vidi per la prima volta la considerai una persona veramente insolita. Infatti mi ricordo che dissi ad Alfred Kapp, in modo abbastanza rude direi, ACP che guarda che esemplare. Con la sua camicia scarlatta, garibaldina, contrastava notevolmente con il grigiore della fattoria in cui si trovava. Sapevo che era straniera e sentendola parlare un perfetto francese con la sua compagna, pensai subito ad una parigina. C'era qualcosa in lei di imperioso ed allo stesso tempo compassionevole. Sapete, uno dei miei hobby era quello di leggere le persone dalle loro facce ed ella aveva un volto deciso, pieno di potere misto a raffinatezza e cultura. La seguii nel giardino. Si era preparata una sigaretta e stava cercando i fiammiferi quando colsi l'occasione di fare la sua conoscenza. Permettez-moi, madame. Le accesi la sigaretta ed iniziamo a conversare in francese. Mi disse di essere profondamente interessata ai fenomeni descritti nel Daily Graphic, ma nonostante ciò aveva avuto dubbi sul venire lì.
Non avevo idea di chi fosse. Gli dissi che avevo paura che il colonnello Olcott mi citasse in uno dei suoi articoli.
Non dovreste temere ciò, egli vi nominerà solo se glielo permetterete. Sono sicuro che lo farà perché io sono il colonnello Olcott. Ella rise senza imbarazzo e si presentò. Era la prima volta che sentivo quel nome, che sarebbe diventato un fattore così importante nella mia vita. Qui tutto si è reso chiaro. Lo spiritualismo che è stata mandata a divulgare in America per sostituire il rozzo sistema dei medium occidentali era lo spiritualismo orientale. Una cosa necessaria al tempo era far fronte allo scetticismo materialista e rinforzare le basi spirituali della bramosia religiosa. Perciò, unendosi a loro in battaglia, prese posizione accanto agli spiritisti americani e per il momento sostenne la stessa causa.
Soon, however, their interests would go in a different direction from that of spiritualism. Blavatsky eventually made her home in New York City, where she and Olcott continued to meet regularly with others who shared their interests. Her door was open to all, recalled the colonel. The decor of the lamasery, as her apartment was called, reflected HPB's exotic style. Meetings on Egyptian symbolism, the Kabbalah, and Eastern mysteries became frequent events, and in September of 1875, a resolution was passed that a society be formed for continued study. On October 30th, 1875, bylaws for the Theosophical Society were adopted and officers were elected. Henry Olcott was the first president, while Madame Blavatsky became the corresponding secretary. On November 17th, 1875, the society officially began at New York's Mott Memorial Hall, where Colonel Olcott gave his inaugural address. The original bylaws said, "The objects of the society are to collect and diffuse knowledge of the laws which govern the universe." Over the next 20 years, these objects were frequently revised, until a final version of 3 was decided upon in 1896. Since then, they have remained essentially unchanged.
Back in New York, as they continued their investigation into things like this, and HPB brought Olcott more and more into her world of the Eastern wisdom and Eastern masters. It led up to regular meetings of people of congenial tastes at their home, one of them being called the Lamasery, because it was a sort of like a place where persons of spiritual interest could foregather. And in 1875, as you know, they decided to form a society to further this investigation. And this leads up to the inaugural address, which was delivered on November 17, 1875. So,
yes. Let me ask you, Robert, could you say a word about why, when the organization of the society was really, well, it began in September of 1875, and then in October 1875 they elected officers. Why then didn't he give the inaugural address then?
Well, to be honest, I'm not sure. Possibly on the model of the American presidency, where the inauguration
I think it was. I think somewhere in
the
old
election and
yes.
the installation, there are some countries where the new government takes office the day after the election,
yes.
but that's never been the practice here, for better or worse. And
I think somewhere
he probably needed time to write his address. There's obviously a lot of work has gone into this address.
It really did.
So,
but I think that he really was following the American custom of the setting an inaugural date. For us now, it's in January, of course. And,
yes. In those days, it was actually in March.
Yes, it used to be March.
Right.
And I think that somewhere there is a statement by HPB to the effect that the society was to be modeled on the American Republic.
Yes, Olcott makes the point in the address that maybe a slight exaggeration, but he does make the point that he felt the Theosophical Society could only have been established in America, that is the United States, because it required that kind of freedom of religion and expression, which, as we know, is far from perfect, and certainly was far from perfect then, but nevertheless was definitely in the 19th century well ahead of most of the rest of the world.
Yes.
And people were well aware of that.
This is from November 17th in 1875. It was the first meeting of the newly formed Theosophical Society. And this is from Henry Steele Olcott's inaugural address. In future times, when the impartial historian shall write an account of the progress of religious ideas in the present century, the formation of this Theosophical Society, whose first meeting, under its formal declaration of principles, we are now attending, will not pass unnoticed. What is it, then, which makes me say, what in deepest seriousness and a full knowledge of its truth I have said? What is it that makes me not only content, but proud to stand for the brief moment as the mouthpiece and the figurehead of this movement, risking abuse, misrepresentation, and every vile assault? It is the fact that in my soul I feel that behind us, behind our little band, behind our feeble newborn organization, there gathers a mighty power that nothing can withstand, the power of truth. Because I feel that we are only the advance guard, holding the pass until the main body shall come up. Because I feel that we are enlisted in a holy cause, and that truth, now as always, is mighty and will prevail. Because I see around us a multitude of people of many different creeds worshiping through sheer ignorance, shams and effete superstitions, and who are only waiting to be shown the audacity and dishonesty of their spiritual guides, to call them to account, and to begin to think for themselves. Because I feel, as a sincere theosophist, that we shall be able to give to science such evidences of the truth of the ancient philosophy and the comprehensiveness of ancient science, that her drift toward atheism will be arrested, and our chemists will, as Madame Blavatsky expresses it, set to work to learn a new alphabet of science on the lap of Mother Nature. As a believer in theosophy, theoretical and practical, I personally am confident that this society will be the means of furnishing such unanswerable proofs of the immortality of the soul that none but fools will doubt. I believe that the time will come when men will be as ashamed of ever having advocated atheism in any of its forms as 30 years hence they will be of ever having owned a slave or countenanced human slavery. Look back the very few years to the time when William Lloyd Garrison was led through Boston streets with a rope around his neck. Compare that with the present state of the slavery question, and then tell me what may not a few earnest, determined, unselfish persons do. Why, in 1859, I myself went at the risk of my life to report for the New York Tribune the hanging of John Brown. And in 1857, while I was visiting Senator Hammond of South Carolina, solely in my character of a student of scientific agriculture, and having nothing whatever to do with politics, an Augusta paper advised my commission to jail because I wrote for the Tribune, although only upon agriculture. Having passed through such experiences and seen so complete a reversal of conditions within the space of less than a score of years, I feel that neither I nor this society incurs any great danger by displaying a little moral courage in so good a cause. Let the future take care of itself. It is for us to so shape the present as to make it beget what we desire and what will bring honor upon us. If we are true to each other and true to ourselves, we shall surmount every obstacle, vanquish every foe, and attain what are all in search of, the peace of mind which comes from absolute knowledge. If we are divided, irresolute, temporizing, Jesuitical, we shall fail as a society. To do what is now clearly within our reach, and future years will doubtless see us bewailing the loss of such a golden opportunity as comes to few persons in a succession of centuries. Our society is, I may say, without precedent. From the days when the Neoplatonists and the last theurgists of Alexandria were scattered by the murderous hand of Christianity, until now, the revival of a study of theosophy has not been attempted. If I rightly apprehend our work, it is to aid in freeing the public mind of theological superstition and attain subservience to the arrogance of science. However much or little we may do, I think it would have been hardly possible to hope for anything if the work had been begun in any country which did not afford perfect political and religious liberty. It certainly would have been useless to attempt it, except in one where all religions stand alike before the law, and where religious heterodoxy works no abridgment of civil rights. No, we are neither of these, but simply investigators, of earnest purpose and unbiased mind, who study all things, prove all things, and hold fast to that which is good. The Hermetists of the Middle Ages were all Neoplatonists, and learned their doctrines from them. In some respects, we resembled them, and yet they had dogmas to impart, which under our bylaws we have not. And further, they were all believers in theosophy, while we are, with 2 or 3 exceptions, simply investigators, undertaking a task far more difficult than theirs, since we have no ready-made material for belief at our hand, but must create it for ourselves. We are of our age, and yet some strides ahead of it, albeit some journals and pamphleteers, more glib than truthful, have already charged us with being reactionists who turn from modern light to medieval and ancient darkness. We seek, inquire, reject nothing without cause, accept nothing without proof. We are students, not teachers. Zeno's pupils taught not only that men should be free from passion and unremoved from joy or grief, but also that they should submit to the unavoidable necessity by which all things are governed. And we found this society in token of our discontent with things as they are, and to endeavor to bring about something better. Thank you.
In 1882, during their travels through India and Ceylon, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Colonel Henry Steele Olcott were taken to view a property known in those days as Huddlestone Gardens. It consisted of a palatial building on the south bank of the Adyar River. Flanked by ancient trees, the property was suggestive of an enchanting country residence. At first glance, commented the Colonel, we knew our future home was found.
People often ask why Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott decided on India as the home for the Theosophical Society. They chose to settle at Adyar, which at that time was a small and undeveloped suburb of Madras, located along India's tropical southeast coast.
The attitude with which they came is demonstrated by that account of how Olcott, when arriving on the soil of India, bent down to worship that soil. They felt that from India had gone out a great deal of wisdom, which is even now contained in the profound teachings not only of the Hindu tradition but Buddhist, Jaina and so on. There was a spirit of tolerance as well here, of universality. India gave a place of shelter to many different people. So since that time it has not merely been the administrative headquarters, but what people have called a flaming center. That means a center from which a spiritual force can flow out into the world. I have heard that when HPB went to the headquarters building, she came down after going up. She declared, the masters want this. Therefore, the center, I think, has an importance which is not merely that of its physical beauty, but of something else which impregnates it. Perhaps it has the conditions which make it favorable for the forces from higher regions to get concentrated and to flow out.
HPB and Colonel Olcott sailed for India from New York City in December of 1878, 3 years after the founding of the Theosophical Society. With a short 2-week stay in London, they finally landed in Bombay 2 months after their United States departure, hoping to establish a base from which to explore and spread theosophical ideas.
From Bombay, they would travel, speak, and write almost non-stop for the next 3 years before discovering the Society's new home. Their popularity grew rapidly. People who had heard about them but had never seen them before felt that some new light was coming. Much of this newfound popularity came after the commencement of the Theosophist movement.
Is on Olcott and Blavatsky, Theosophical Twins, and is also subtitled An Essay in Archetypes. Now, in Volume 1 of Old Diary Leaves, Olcott, speaking of Blavatsky and himself, wrote, "We used to speak of ourselves as the Theosophical Twins." His reference to Blavatsky and himself as theosophical twins has depths that are not immediately apparent. On the surface, it seems to be just a statement that they were alike with respect to theosophy. However, the expression evokes archetypal reference as well. My remarks this morning, therefore, are an essay or an attempt to explore that evocation by considering 4 things. First, the nature of archetypes. Second, the extent and meaning of the archetype of the twins. Third, how that archetype applies to Olcott and Blavatsky. And finally, how it applies also to all of us as well. Helps us to define our relationships with other human beings, either cooperating or contending. Cooperation and contention are not mutually exclusive. Indeed, as the myth of Gilgamesh and Enkidu shows, ideally contention leads to fraternal cooperation. All human relationships involve both contention and cooperation. What is needed is a balance between those opposites. And that observation brings us to the point of my talk, Olcott and Blavatsky. Part 3, Olcott and Blavatsky as twins. Archetypes have a way of expressing themselves, not just in myths and literature, but in the lives of real people. In Old Diary Leaves, Henry Steele Olcott, referring to Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and himself, famously declared, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, "We used to speak of ourselves as the Theosophical Twins." What does Olcott's statement mean? What can we conclude from his own words that he intended by that declaration? And what difference does it make? Those questions are the subject of the rest of my remarks this morning. With regard to ends and commitments, Olcott and Blavatsky were embodiments of the cooperating twins. And that is doubtless what Olcott had primarily in mind when he penned that line. But Olcott and Blavatsky were sharply different in other ways, and those differences sometimes led to their being embodiments of the contending twins. That combination of cooperation and contention is quite normal in human interrelationships. I will now just throw in a little side remark. When I was actually in my teen years, I worked in the Miami Public Library, and the reference librarian there once told me that in the 35 years of her marriage, she and her husband had never exchanged a crossword. I didn't believe her. I still don't believe her. Olcott and Blavatsky were alike in their total commitment to the work of the masters. Blavatsky's lifelong devotion to the masters was the theme of everything she did. And of Olcott, the master K.H. famously wrote, "Him can we trust under all circumstances. His faithful service is pledged to us, come well, come ill. Where can we find an equal devotion? He is one who may make innumerable mistakes out of excessive zeal, but never is unwilling to repair his fault, even at the cost of the greatest self-humiliation. Who esteems the sacrifice and comfort and even life as something to be cheerfully risked whenever necessary. Who will eat any food, or even go without, sleep on any bed, work in any place, fraternize with any outcast, endure any privation for the cause." It was such faithful service, devotion, and sacrifice that Olcott and Blavatsky shared, making them twins. They were the two chief founders of the Theosophical Society and the two chief framers of what modern theosophy was to become. Blavatsky on its inner theoretical side and Olcott on its outer applied side. Olcott himself says of their relationship, "She was the teacher, I was the pupil. She, the misunderstood and insulted messenger of the great ones. I, the practical brain to plan, the right hand to work out the practical details. Under the Hindu classification, she would be the teaching Brahmin, I, the fighting Kshatriya, warrior. Under the Buddhist one, she would be the bhikshu, the spiritual teacher, I, the working jhaka, or layperson." Neither the Theosophical Society nor Theosophy would be what it is today if it were not for the joint work of those theosophical twins. There existed, as Olcott says, and this is a quotation again from old diary leaves, there existed an indestructible focus of vitality in the quenchless enthusiasm of the two friends, the Russian woman and the American man, who were in deadly earnest, who never for a moment harbored a doubt as to the existence of their masters, the excellence of the delegated work, or the ultimate complete success that would crown it. The one thing we felt more and more as time went on was that we too could absolutely depend upon each other for theosophy, though the sky itself should crack, and beyond that, all else depended upon circumstances. The twinship of the two friends involved more than shared ideals. A psychic connection also united them. An example of that connection was recounted by Olcott in describing a dreadful fire that occurred near Adyar while HPB was in Europe. He said, "A dreadful tragedy occurred in People's Park, Madras, during the days of the December 1885 convention. Some 300 or 400 persons were burnt alive in a panic that seized them when some palm leaf shops and fences accidentally caught fire at the fair that was in progress. The reason for my mentioning this is that the wave of agony that it created in the astral light reached HPB in her lodgings in Belgium and threw her into the gravest excitement for our safety." He goes on, "This is a most instructive psychological phenomenon. The wave of agony of which I spoke touched Adyar, of course, first of all, being so near, and from me passed on to HPB, with whom I was spiritually so intimately connected. Similarly, when she died in London in 1891, I was made aware of it in Sydney, New South Wales. New South Wales? Yes. We used to call ourselves twins, and twins we were, so far as community of sympathies within the lines of our work was concerned. No great wonder, considering how we had worked together. Now, at times, some efforts were made by others to drive a wedge between the twins, but their commitment to each other and to the masters overcame all such efforts. In the course of one such divisive effort in 1887, Blavatsky wrote to Olcott from England, and Olcott records her message thus: "She begs me on the score of the real, more than fraternal affection she has for me, her internal, not external loyalty to me as her colleague, chum, and co-worker in master's work, to break up the Indian part of the conspiracy." In another letter she writes, "I love you more than anyone on earth save Master. My friendship and brotherly affection for you are eternal. And if you believe me capable of going back on you, let alone the TS, then you are a blank." Blavatsky had no inhibitions about her language. Olcott goes on, "Her use of the word eternal has a deeper meaning than appears on the surface, as those who have traced back the mutual relations between us two in past lives, both men and all of them, will understand. Suffice it to say that this is not the first time we have been closely associated in the evolutionary paths of our two entities." End of quote. However, their mutual interaction is more than merely a historical fact. It is also a reflection of archetypal reality, mentally and spiritually. When we interact with one another, we will sometimes have conflicts, just as Olcott and Blavatsky did. But if we are inspired by the wise example of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, we will transform our conflicts with one another into cooperation, and our cooperation will be the stronger and the wiser for growing out of friendly conflict. That is precisely what happened in the lives of Olcott and Blavatsky. It is what needs to happen in each of us as we interact with our fellows. The archetypal twins also stand for two aspects inside each one of us. Our one aspect is our higher individuality, our archetype. The other aspect is our lower personality, the reflection in time and space of that individual archetype. Our personality's empirical and pragmatic mind has everything to do with the external and practical in our lives, just as Olcott did with the administrative affairs of the society. Our individuality's intuitive and noetic mind has everything to do with the internal and spiritual in our lives, just as Blavatsky did with the spiritual affairs of theosophy. These two aspects of our nature, personality and individuality, are, as it were, our Olcott and Blavatsky, both necessary and indispensable, but each properly in charge of its own sphere within our lives. Olcott and Blavatsky, the theosophical twins, are part of history, but as reflections of ahistorical, archetypical reality, they are also part of us. This is true because, as the Emerald Tablet says, what is below is like what is above, and what is above is like what is below, for the accomplishments of the wonders of the one thing. The one thing is the conscious realization of the unity of all existence, of our lower and higher selves, of each of us with every other, of all of us with the one reality that underlies all existence. In that realization are wonders indeed. And to achieve that realization, we can do no better than to follow in the archetypal footsteps of the Theosophical Twins.
Oh, era così testarda. Ma era più vicina a me di qualsiasi sorella di sangue, come se ci fossimo sempre conosciuti. Sebbene diversi in temperamento e abilità, quanto due persone possono essere, e spesso in totale disaccordo sui dettagli, eravamo un'unica mente e cuore riguardo al lavoro e nella devozione ai nostri maestri, i vecchi supervisori e progettisti di quel lavoro. L'ho amata per quell'altro sé, il suo sé più elevato, che era anche il più misterioso. Chi ci vedeva insieme avrebbe pensato che io avevo la sua più alta considerazione, ma in realtà, a dispetto di tutte le ore trascorse insieme, svolgendo il lavoro di tutti i giorni, era un enigma tanto per me quanto per tutti gli altri.
Colonel Olcott, and the story is, of course, part of the history of the Theosophical Society, and they were in New York, and at the time of the founding of the society, he received letters from another branch known as the Brotherhood of Luxor.
Also known as the Egyptian Brotherhood, the distinctive feature of their letters was that they were written on a kind of black paper, and like most all of the Mahatma letters, contained various occult symbols which identified the particular group. These early letters can be found in C. Jinnarajadasa's book, Letters from the Masters of the Wisdom, and are reported to have been in connection with this group's interest in the formation of the Theosophical Society.
The chief of the Egyptian Brotherhood is said to be the adept who called himself Serapis Bey, and associated with him were others, among whom was Tuitit Bey, referred to several times by HPB. And this is the first page of the letter from this section, which begins, "Brother Neophyte, we greet thee. He who seeks us finds us. Try." And that word try appeared again and again and again in these early letters to Colonel Olcott.
In 1888, Olcott took ship to England, intending to put down what he judged to be an incipient insurrection. On board ship, he received a letter from the Master K.H., which included the following. HPB has next to no concern with administrative details and should be kept clear of them, insofar as her strong nature can be controlled. But this you must tell to all. With occult matters, she has everything to do. We have not abandoned her. She is not given over to chelas. She is our direct agent. I warn you against permitting your suspicions and resentments against her many follies to bias your intuitive loyalty to her. In the adjustment of this European business, this was at a time when Europe wanted to break away from the international society and form its own independent group with HPB at its head. In the adjustment of this European business, you will have two things to consider: the external and administrative, and the internal and psychical. Keep the former under your control, and that of your most prudent assistants jointly. Leave the latter to her. You are left to devise the practical details with your usual ingenuity. Only be careful, I say, when some emergent interference of hers in practical affairs is referred to you on appeal, to discriminate between that which is merely exoteric in origin and effects and that which, beginning on the practical, tends to beget consequences on the spiritual plane. As to the former, you are the best judge. As to the latter, she. The Master's comment defines, as well as anything can, the respective spheres, responsibilities, and mutual interaction of the two theosophical twins.
As part of the rebuilding efforts, Colonel Olcott also toured the US. But now in his 70s, he suffered from a weak heart and rheumatic problems. During his return trip to Adyar, he was further weakened when he fell down a ship's stairway. He completed his long journey to the place that for years now had been his real home, but died soon after, on February 17th, 1907.
The funeral obsequies. February 17, 1907. Colonel Olcott died peacefully at the Theosophical Society's headquarters, Adyar, at 7:17 a.m. in the presence of Mrs. Annie Besant, Mrs. Russick, Miss Renda, and his professional night nurse, Miss Smart. He was laid on his bier at 12:30 p.m., and it was lowered over the parapet into the garden and carried into the large hall where a flower-ringed space had been prepared for its reception. At the east were placed small tables bearing the Vedas, the Zenavesta, the Pitakas, the Bible, Al-Quran, the Anagratha, and a Jain manuscript representing the varied faiths of the world. The body, with the head uncovered, draped with his own national flag and the Buddhist flag, lay in the hall, while hundreds of people, men, women, and children, Westerners and Easterners, Hindus of all castes, Buddhists, and Chamas, filed past it, each casting on it a few flowers, until nothing was visible save the white head and a great mass of blossoms. At 3:30 p.m., the representatives of Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity came within the enclosure and grouped themselves round Mrs. Annie Besant on the platform. The ceremony was opened by the Buddhists, as the colonel was a professed Buddhist, and they chanted some Pali verses, and one of their number spoke a few words of gratitude for what the colonel had done for Buddhism. Two Brahmins followed, chanting some Sanskrit verses, and the Honorable Sir Sri Subramania Iyer, representing, Sir Sri Subramania Iyer, voiced the Hindus' love and thanks. Then came a representative Parsi, who chanted from the Zenavesta and made a short speech of gratitude for the services rendered to the Zoroastrianism by the colonel. A fine passage from the Book of Wisdom preceded a well-spoken tribute from a Christian. Mrs. Besant advanced to the side of the body and said, Brothers, we are here today not to bid farewell to our dear President, for there is no farewell between spirit and spirit, but to bid farewell to this cast-off garment of his, for which for the last 31 years he has so bravely striven to serve humanity. We are here to take with all love and reverence this cast-off garment to the fire, which we shall give back to the elements which is theirs, so that nature, the mother, may use again these elements for new forms of beauty and of life. You heard our Buddhist brethren chant their loving farewell, and you heard Buddhist lips with faltering tongue say words of gratitude for what this man, their co-religionist, had done for Buddhism. Then came the solemn rhythm of the familiar Sanskrit, and Hindu lips spoke the same deep gratitude for what he had wrought for Hinduism. For he found these two ancient faiths despised. He found the men belonging to them ashamed of them, and he so labored that the youth of both faiths respect their scriptures, are proud of their Dharma, and with uplifted heads declare their fealty to the faith of their fathers. And I, a theosophist, what shall I say of him who, loving all religions, yet loved most that God-wisdom in which all faiths are blended, from which they all proceed? How shall I speak our gratitude to him who, with his noble colleague H.P. Blavatsky, founded this Theosophical Society for the revitalizing of religions and the spiritual good of men? For this he labored ceaselessly. As he lay dying through long weeks of weariness and suffering, this was his constant thought. And even when from excess of weariness his thoughts began to wander, even then they ever lingered round the welfare of this movement, dearest of all to his heart. This morning came from their far-off ashrams in the snowy Himalayas his own master, wearing the Rajput form, with that other gentlest one in form of Kashmiri Brahmin, and yet one other, Egyptian-born, who had him also in charge, and they, with his dearest friend, HPB, came to fetch him to rest with them in their home in the far north. His own Gurudeva snapped the cord that bound the man to his cast-off garment, and sleeping in his master's arms, as it were, he passed from earth. Oh, the joy of the suffering over, the weariness at rest, the burden of the flesh laid down. Then turning to the body, Mrs. Besant said, "And now, dear friend, we bear away your body. We bid you not farewell, for you, unborn, undying, perpetual, eternal, there is no such thing as death. We have served your body while we could, tended it, loved it. Now we give it back to the elements whence it came. Brave soldier of truth, striver for good, we wish you light and peace. And by this dead body we pledge you our faith. I, to bear on the standard of theosophy, fallen from this cold hand, if the society confirm the choice you made, along the road as you have borne it, all to serve theosophy through life to death as you have served it. So long as this society endures, through the years of an unmeasured future, so long shall your name live in and with it." And here is our President's last message, signed by his own hand on February 2nd, to be read above his body. Dear friend, your lips are still. My voice speaks your words. To my beloved brothers in the physical body, I bid you all farewell. In memory of me, carry on the grand work of proclaiming and living the brotherhood of religions. To my beloved brothers on the higher planes, I greet and come to you. and implore you to help me to impress all men on earth that there is no religion higher than truth, and that in the brotherhood of religions lies the peace and progress of humanity. The bearers then advanced, 6 Brahmins and 4 Buddhists, and the bier was raised in procession form to the funeral pyre, raised in a secluded spot in the compound. Reverently and tenderly, the body was placed on its last resting place, and the wood piled around and over it. Soon the flashing flames leapt up, radiant even in the sunlight that poured through the leafy palm grove, and the great concourse sat around the pyre, paying their last tribute of respect. Gradually the people left, and all was over. On the 18th morning the ashes were collected, and part of them was carried out to sea and scattered on the waves. Part was put into a casket to be carried to Benares, to rejoin in the bed of the holy Ganga, the ashes dropped therein of H.P. Blavatsky.